Beneath the blazing sun of West Africa, there once stood a kingdom so proud, so radiant, that its name echoed far beyond its borders, Benin. At its heart was Benin City, a masterpiece carved from vision and sweat, where order and beauty lived side by side. Travelers who walked its wide, straight streets often stood in awe, for they saw not a scattered settlement, but a city planned with the precision of a craftsman's hand. High earthen walls and deep moats embraced the city like protective arms, fortifying it against enemies and marking its power for all who approached. At the very center rose the palace of the king, vast and commanding, its courtyards alive with ceremony. It was not just a palace but a symbol, the beating heart of authority and the spiritual anchor of the people. Within its walls, coral-beaded chiefs moved with dignity, while the king himself was revered almost as a living deity, a bridge between the people and their gods. Life in Benin flowed with rhythm. The clang of the blacksmith, the chants of market women, and the drumbeats of festivals filled the air. Traders bustled through markets heavy with ivory, pepper, cloth, and bronze, their goods sought by merchants who came from far lands across the sea. Artisans gave life to bronze and ivory, shaping the stories of kings and warriors into works that shimmered with genius, each one a history book cast in metal. And yet, Benin was not only art and trade. Its warriors stood tall, fierce, and loyal, guarding the honor of the empire with spears, bows, and unyielding courage. Festivals lit the streets with color and song, binding the people together in joy, while traditions, passed from ancestor to child, carried the soul of the empire from one generation to the next. This was Benin before the shadows came, a city of brilliance, a people of pride, a kingdom whose glory seemed untouchable. The soul of Benin was not only in its walls or warriors, but in the art that spoke louder than any sword. Here, bronze was not just metal, it was memory. The hands of Benin's guild of craftsmen, trained through generations, poured fire into clay molds and birthed the Benin Bronzes, plaques, heads, and figures so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Each told a story of kings in coral crowns, of warriors in battle, of ceremonies that bound the living to the ancestors. But art alone did not hold the spirit of the empire. The heart of Benin pulsed through its shrines, its rituals, and its faith. The king was more than a ruler, he was a sacred figure, a bridge between the earth and the unseen. In his palace, rituals honored the ancestors, offerings rose with smoke to the gods, and festivals kept the balance of life and spirit. Coral beads, worn heavy on chiefs and nobles, were not merely decoration, they carried power, status, and the blessing of tradition. The outside world, too, felt the pull of Benin's greatness. From the 15th century, Portuguese sailors docked at its shores, their eyes widening at the wealth and discipline of the kingdom. Trade flowed like a river, ivory, pepper, and cloth exchanged for coral, copper, firearms, and fine goods from across the seas. The Dutch followed, then the British, each eager to taste the riches of this proud empire. Yet behind the trade lay careful control. Benin decided when and how to open its gates. No foreigner dictated the rhythm of its markets, the empire held its own keys. This union of art, spirit, and trade gave Benin its soul, a kingdom that spoke in bronze, lived in ritual, and negotiated with the world on its own proud terms. Now, from this brilliance, the winds of change begin to stir. The shadows of envy and ambition draw nearer. But even the brightest skies cannot hold the sun forever, and over Benin, dark clouds began to gather. By the late 19th century, the British had fixed their eyes firmly on the riches of the Niger Delta. Palm oil had become the lifeblood of their factories, ivory was prized in Europe, and the control of trade routes promised not just wealth, but dominance. To them, Benin was not a sovereign kingdom, it was a door they wanted opened, a prize waiting to be claimed. Yet, Benin was no kingdom that bent easily. The king of Benin, Ovenramwen Nogbezi, stood like a tree rooted deep in tradition. He guarded his empire's independence with fierce resolve. Foreigners could come, yes, but only on terms set by the kingdom. Markets did not open at the clap of foreign hands, nor could British merchants wander the empire as they pleased. Restrictions were firm, and the king kept his gates half shut, wary of the creeping shadow of control. This insistence on sovereignty became a thorn in Britain's side. To them, trade must be free, but free meant free for themselves, not for Benin. Their ships came often, their demands grew louder, and their patience thinner. Letters turned into threats, and threats hardened into plans. In the spaces between diplomacy and deceit, tension rose like a tightening drum. Benin, proud and unyielding, believed it could stand firm against the rising tide. The king's court continued its rituals, the people their festivals, and the warriors sharpened their spears. But beneath it all, the ground trembled. The world beyond Benin was changing, empires were being carved up by European hands, and the British would not wait forever. It was only a matter of time before the storm would break, and when it did, its fury would fall on the walls of Benin. The year was 1897, and the storm finally broke. The British came forward with what they called a peaceful mission, a delegation of men claiming they sought only trade and dialogue. But beneath the veil of diplomacy lay steel. Hidden among their ranks were armed escorts, their steps heavy with intent. To Benin, the timing was suspect. The king, steeped in ritual at the turn of the new year, had warned against such intrusion. Visitors were forbidden during sacred ceremonies, yet the British pressed on, determined to force their way through. As the column pushed toward Benin City, the forest around them came alive. Warriors, fierce and loyal, lay in wait along the narrow path. They were not fooled by talk of peace, they saw the mission for what it was, a threat wrapped in courtesy. And so the drums of war were struck. Arrows flew, muskets roared, and the quiet bush erupted into chaos. When the smoke cleared, the British mission lay in ruin. Many of its members had fallen, their ambitions silenced by Benin's defiance. To the people of Benin, it was defense, a warning to those who came uninvited, a stand for their sovereignty. But to Britain, it was the perfect excuse. News of the ambush sped across the seas, painted not as resistance, but as savagery. The press cried out for retribution, and the British government answered swiftly. Plans were drawn, troops assembled, and ships loaded with weapons far deadlier than spears and muskets. The so-called trade mission had set the final spark. Britain now had the justification it needed, and vengeance would march under the banner of empire. Benin's fate was sealed, though its people did not yet know how heavy the storm would fall. In February of 1897, the forest paths trembled under the march of foreign boots. The British had returned not with merchants or words, but with war. Columns of soldiers advanced, their uniforms sharp, their rifles gleaming, and behind them the terrible hum of the Maxim gun, a weapon that spat death faster than 100 warriors could draw their bows. Heavy artillery rolled through the bush, iron mouths ready to roar. This was not a mission, it was a machine of conquest. The warriors of Benin stood to meet them. Clad in tradition, bound by oath, they faced the invaders with courage that defied the odds. Spears glinted in the sun, muskets cracked, and battle cries split the air like thunder. They fought not just for a city, but for the soul of their kingdom. Yet bravery, no matter how fierce, was no match for the storm of European firepower. The Maxim gun rattled, cutting down lines of men in seconds. Cannons thundered, tearing holes through walls that had stood for centuries. As the battle raged, flames leapt skyward. Benin City, once a jewel of order and splendor, was set ablaze. Thatched roofs became torches, markets turned to ash, and even the proud courtyards of the king's palace were swallowed in fire. Smoke curled into the heavens, carrying with it centuries of heritage. The cries of the wounded mingled with the crackle of burning timber, and the once bustling streets lay silent under the weight of ruin. It was not a simple victory. It was devastation, deliberate and merciless. Where art had flourished, embers now smoldered. Where families had lived, charred remains whispered of loss. The Punitive Expedition had struck its mark, and Benin's glory, once untouchable, now lay beneath the boots of empire. When the fires dimmed and the guns grew silent, the true plunder began. British soldiers moved through the ashes of Benin City, not only to conquer but to strip the kingdom of its very soul. From the sacred palace, from shrines, from the homes of nobles, they carried away treasures unlike anything the world had seen. Bronze plaques, ivory tusks, carved masks, coral regalia, thousands of pieces that told the story of a people, a kingdom, an unbroken line of kings. Each artwork was more than beauty, it was memory cast in metal, history carved in ivory, spirit woven into form. But in the eyes of the conquerors, these were spoils. Crates were filled, ships were loaded, and soon the lifeblood of Benin's culture sailed away across the seas. In London, auctions displayed them under the glare of chandeliers. From there, they spread like scattered seeds, to Berlin, to Paris, to Boston, to New York. Museums hung them on walls and placed them in glass cases, their labels neat and cold, stripped of the fire that birthed them. To foreign audiences, they were marvels of African art. To Benin, they were wounds, reminders of what had been stolen. For the people left behind, the loss was more than material. The Benin Bronzes had carried the voices of their ancestors, the proof of their kings, the rhythm of their traditions. Now those voices were silenced, trapped behind foreign glass. A kingdom once proud was left hollow, its identity torn from its hands and scattered to distant lands. The looting was not just of objects, but of dignity. It was the theft of a civilization's memory, a robbery so complete that its echo still lingers, as calls for the return of the treasures continue to this day. Amid the smoke and ruin, the throne of Benin stood empty. King Ovenramwan Nogbezi, once the living symbol of the empire's strength, had fled the burning city, seeking refuge in the forests that had long sheltered his people in times of war. But the British hunted him relentlessly, their victory incomplete until the king himself was in their grasp. Months passed, and at last, surrounded and betrayed by circumstance, he was captured. In 1897, the great king was led away not as a sovereign, but as a prisoner. The man who had once been hailed as divine, who wore coral beads heavy with centuries of power, was stripped of his kingdom and exiled to Calabar, far from the heart of his fathers. There, in silence and shadow, he lived out the remainder of his days until his death in 1914. His palace lay in ruins, his city in ashes, his people scattered under foreign rule. For the people of Benin, his exile was more than the removal of a king. It was the breaking of a chain that had bound their past to their present. The king had been their bridge to the ancestors, their shield in times of trial. With his departure, it was as though the spirit of the empire itself had been carried away. The fall of Ovenramwan was not just the fall of a man, it was the symbolic end of Benin's sovereignty, the moment when a proud kingdom was folded into the maps of empire. Yet, even in defeat, his memory lived. Among his people, the king remained a figure of dignity, a reminder of the cost of resistance, and a seed of identity that foreign conquest could not fully erase. His exile left an emptiness, but within that emptiness, the spirit of Benin waited, unbroken, to endure. When the dust of 1897 finally settled, Benin was no longer an empire. Its proud city was folded into the map of the British colony, its independence erased by the ink of conquest. The moats that once guarded its greatness lay quiet, and the wide streets that had dazzled travelers became scars of silence. For the people, life continued, but under a shadow. The once mighty kingdom that had chosen its own path now walked to the drumbeat of foreign masters. Yet, history is not so easily buried. Though the king was gone, though the palace smoldered, the spirit of Benin did not die. Traditions survived in whispers and in practice, festivals still honored the ancestors, coral beads still carried their weight of meaning, and the royal line, though wounded, endured. In time, the throne of the king was restored, not as a sovereign power, but as a custodian of culture and memory, a living link to a past that refused to vanish. Across the seas, the treasures of Benin gleamed in foreign museums, their beauty undeniable, their absence painful. For more than a century, the Benin Bronzes stood as both marvels and reminders, marvels to the world, reminders to Benin of what had been stolen. Today, voices rise louder, calling for their return, demanding that memory be restored to its rightful home. Piece by piece, the world begins to reckon with that loss, and some treasures find their way back across the waters. The fall of Benin was not just the end of a kingdom, it was the silencing of a song. But songs, even silenced, can be remembered. And in Benin today, among its people, its art, its palace, and its enduring traditions, that song still plays. Broken, yet unbowed, the legacy of the Benin Empire lives on, a reminder of Africa's greatness, its wounds, and its undying will to rise again.